I, 34F, recently discovered a secret my parents had been hiding for years, and now our family is falling apart. Ida? Let me start by giving you some background about myself. I've always been an independent and perfectionist person, with a high level of empathy for others. I work as an IT project manager at a multinational tech company, a job that requires precision and attention to detail. I've been married to my husband, 36M, for 3 years now, but lately, he's been struggling to balance his work and our home life. Last week, while visiting my parents' house, I stumbled upon something that would change my life forever. I was looking through old family photo albums when I noticed there weren't any baby pictures of me. At first, I thought it was just an oversight, maybe they were stored in a different album. But as I flipped through album after album, the absence became glaringly obvious. Confused and a bit unsettled, I asked my mother about it. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and I watched her carefully as I posed the question. "Oh, we must have misplaced those albums," she said with a nervous laugh. But I could see the unease in her eyes, the way her hands suddenly became unsteady as she chopped vegetables. My gut told me there was more to this story. I pressed further, "Mom, there's not a single baby picture of me in any of the albums. How is that possible?" She avoided my gaze, focusing intently on the carrots she was slicing. "You know how disorganized we can be, sweetie. I'm sure they're around somewhere. We'll look for them later, okay?" Her dismissive tone only fueled my suspicion. I decided to drop the subject for the moment, but I was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. That evening, after dinner, I managed to get my father alone. We were in his study, a room that had always felt like a sanctuary to me. The walls were lined with books, and the scent of old paper and leather filled the air. It was here, surrounded by the familiar comfort of literature, that I decided to confront him. "Dad," I started, my heart pounding, "I need to ask you something important." He looked up from his desk, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "What is it, sweetheart?" I took a deep breath. "Why aren't there any baby pictures of me in the family albums?" I watched as his expression changed, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he schooled his features into a neutral mask. "Oh, that," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm sure your mother just misplaced them. You know how she can be with organizing things." But I wasn't buying it. The matching stories, the nervous reactions, it all pointed to something bigger. I pressed him further, my voice trembling slightly. "Dad, please. I know there's something you're not telling me." "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he took a deep breath and said the words that shattered my world. "The truth is, you're adopted." I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The room seemed to spin, and I had to grip the edge of his desk to steady myself. My hands started shaking, and tears welled up in my eyes. Why did you keep this from me for so long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father sighed heavily, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. He suddenly looked much older, the weight of this secret visible in the slump of his shoulders. "We didn't want to hurt you. You were our daughter in every way that mattered." But his words didn't reach me. The fact that they had hidden this truth from me for over 30 years ignited a fire of anger and betrayal within me. All the times I had felt different, all the little comments about not looking like either of them, it all made sense now, in the worst possible way. "You thought lying to me for my entire life wouldn't hurt me?" I shouted, my voice rising with each word. "I had a right to know. How could you keep this from me?" My father tried to reach out to me, but I recoiled from his touch. "We thought we were protecting you," he said, his voice pleading. "We loved you from the moment we saw you. We didn't want you to feel different or unwanted." "Unwanted?" I spat the word out. "And how do you think I feel now? Knowing that my entire life has been built on a lie?" At that moment, my mother burst into the room, her face pale. She must have heard the shouting. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting between my father and me. "They know," my father said quietly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, my voice cold. "Don't call me that. You've lied to me my entire life. You're not my parents. You're just people who raised me." The words were harsh, and I saw the pain they caused flash across their faces. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. I felt betrayed, lost, and utterly alone. I stormed out of the house, ignoring their calls for me to come back, to talk about this. I got in my car and drove, not really knowing where I was going. I ended up at a park where I used to play as a child. I sat on a swing, gently rocking back and forth as I tried to process what had just happened. My entire identity felt like it had been stripped away. Who was I, if not the daughter of the people who raised me? What did this mean for my sense of self, my understanding of my place in the world? The next few days were a blur of emotions. I called in sick to work, unable to face the normalcy of my daily routine when everything in my life suddenly felt so abnormal. My mother cried and apologized profusely over the phone, while my father sent long, heartfelt emails explaining their decision. My brother, who had been away on a business trip, looked bewildered when he returned and found out what had happened. "I had no idea," he said when he came to see me. "I swear, sis, if I had known, I would have told you." I believed him, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made me feel more alone. Even my brother, the person I had grown up with, shared a biological connection with our parents that I didn't. My husband tried to comfort me, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to anyone. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of confusion and anger, and no one could possibly understand what I was going through. The only person I felt I could open up to was my best friend, 34F, a psychologist who understood the complexity of my emotions. "It's natural to feel angry and confused," she said gently during one of our long phone calls. "Your entire worldview has been shaken. But remember, your parents love you, regardless of biology." But her words couldn't quell the storm of anger and distrust raging inside me. Every time I saw a post about adoption on social media, I felt a pang in my chest. I found myself obsessively reading stories of other late discovery adoptees, looking for some guidance on how to navigate this new reality. As the days turned into weeks, my anger didn't subside. If anything, it grew stronger as I thought about all the times I could have been told the truth. All the doctor's appointments where my medical history was incomplete, all the times I had wondered why I didn't look like my parents. They had had so many opportunities to be honest with me. I started to question everything about my childhood. Were the stories they told me about my birth true? Was anything they had ever told me real? The doubt crept into every memory, tainting even the happiest moments of my past. My work began to suffer. I returned to the office, but I couldn't concentrate. The precision and attention to detail that had always been my strong suits were suddenly elusive. I made careless mistakes, forgot important meetings, and snapped at my colleagues over minor issues. My boss called me into his office one day, concern etched on his face. "What's going on with you?" he asked. "This isn't like you at all." I wanted to explain, to pour out everything that had happened, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain that my entire identity had been turned upside down? Instead, I mumbled an apology and promised it wouldn't happen again. But as I left his office, I knew I couldn't keep that promise. The weight of the secret, the anger at my parents, the confusion about my identity, it all pressed down on me, making it difficult to focus on anything else. At home, things weren't much better. My husband, who had initially been supportive, was growing increasingly frustrated with my mood swings and withdrawal. "I understand you're going through a lot," he said one night, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "But you can't shut me out like this. We're supposed to be partners." I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to open up. How could I explain the void I felt inside, the sense that everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie? As the weeks passed, I found myself obsessively searching for information about adoption and adoptees' experiences online. I joined forums and support groups, hungry for any information that might help me make sense of my situation. One night, while scrolling through an adoption forum, I came across a post that hit me like a punch to the gut. It was from someone who had discovered they were adopted in their 30s, just like me. They wrote about the anger, the betrayal, the identity crisis, all the emotions I was grappling with. But they also wrote about forgiveness, about understanding their parents' perspective, about rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of truth. I stared at the screen, tears streaming down my face. Could I do that? Could I forgive my parents for their lie? Could I rebuild my life, my identity, my relationships? The next day, I decided to take a small step. I texted my brother, asking how he was doing. His response was almost immediate. "I'm okay, sis. I miss you." We all do. Those simple words cracked something open inside me. I realized that in my pain and anger, I had pushed away not just my parents, but my brother too, the one person who had always been there for me, who had nothing to do with the decision to keep my adoption a secret. I decided to meet him for coffee. When I saw him, looking worried and a bit unsure, I felt a rush of guilt. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Finally, my brother broke the silence. "Sis, I want you to know, finding out you were adopted doesn't change anything for me. You're still my big sister. You always will be." His words, so simple and sincere, broke down the walls I had built around myself. I started to cry, right there in the middle of the coffee shop. My brother reached across the table and took my hand, and for the first time since the revelation, I felt a glimmer of hope. As we talked, I realized how much I had missed my family, despite my anger. My brother shared how our parents were struggling, how they regretted their decision to keep the secret, how much they missed me. "They made a mistake," he said. "A big one. But they love you, sis. They always have." I left that coffee shop with a lot to think about. The anger was still there, but it was tempered now by a new understanding. My parents had made a huge mistake, but they had made it out of love, however misguided. That night, I had a long talk with my husband. I opened up about everything I was feeling, the anger, the confusion, the fear, but also the longing for my family. "I'm sorry I've been shutting you out," I said. "I didn't know how to deal with all of this." My husband pulled me into a hug. "I'm here for you," he said. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you." The next day, I made a decision. I wasn't ready to forgive my parents completely, but I was ready to start the process. I called them and suggested we meet with a family therapist. When I heard my mother's voice on the phone, choked with emotion as she agreed to the therapy, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, yes, but also relief and a tentative hope. The first therapy session was intense. We all cried, shouted, and said things we had been holding back for weeks. But by the end of it, we had taken the first step towards healing. As we left the therapist's office, my father turned to me. "I know we have a long way to go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want you to know, you've always been our daughter. Always." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching adoption and identity issues. I read books, joined support groups, and even started seeing a therapist on my own. Slowly, I began to untangle my emotions and confront the complex reality of my situation. One night, as I was reading an article about the psychological impact of late discovery adoption, my husband sat down next to me. "How are you doing with all of this?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath. "It's hard," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm making progress, and then something will trigger all those feelings of anger and betrayal again." He nodded, listening intently. "But," I continued, "I'm starting to understand that my parents, they're not perfect. They made a huge mistake in keeping this from me. But they're human. They were trying to protect me, even if they went about it all wrong. My husband squeezed my hand. That's a big realization, he said. I'm proud of you. His support meant more to me than I could express. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The next day at work, I had a breakthrough on a project that had been giving me trouble. As I presented my solution to my team, I felt a familiar surge of confidence. It was a small step, but it felt like I was finally getting back to myself. That evening, I decided to take another step in rebuilding my relationship with my parents. I invited them over for dinner. When they arrived, I could see the nervousness in their eyes, the way they hesitated before stepping into our home. As we sat down to eat, the conversation was stilted at first. But as the evening wore on, we began to relax. We talked about work, about my brother's new job, about the weather, normal, everyday things that we had taken for granted before. At one point, my mother reached out and touched my hand. "We've missed this," she said softly. "We've missed you." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "I've missed you too," I admitted. It wasn't perfect. The hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But it was progress. As my parents were leaving, my father turned to me. "We know we have a lot to make up for," he said. "But we want you to know, we're here. Whenever you're ready to talk about your adoption, about your birth parents, we'll tell you everything we know." His words hit me like a physical force. Until that moment, I hadn't even considered the possibility of learning about my birth parents. The idea opened up a whole new world of questions and possibilities. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with thoughts of my birth parents. Who were they? Why had they given me up? Did I have biological siblings out there somewhere? I turned to my husband, who was reading beside me. I think I want to try to find my birth parents," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. He put down his book and looked at me seriously. "Are you sure? That's a big step." I nodded. "I need to know. It's part of who I am." He pulled me close. "Then we'll figure it out together," he promised. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a mix of excitement and fear. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more emotional hurdles to overcome. But for the first time since learning about my adoption, I felt a sense of hope for the future. I was still angry at my parents for their deception, still hurt by the years of lies. But I was also beginning to see a path forward, a way to integrate this new knowledge into my identity and my life. As I closed my eyes, I made a promise to myself. I would face whatever came next, the search for my birth parents, the continued work on my relationship with my adoptive parents, the ongoing process of redefining my identity with courage and honesty. No more secrets, no more lies. Just the truth, whatever it might be. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I decided to start my search for my birth parents by asking my adoptive parents for any information they might have about my adoption. I knew it would be a difficult conversation, but I felt it was necessary. I called my parents and asked if we could meet. They agreed, and we decided to meet at a local park, a neutral ground that held happy memories from my childhood. When I arrived, I found them sitting on a bench, looking nervous but hopeful. I took a deep breath and sat down beside them. "I want to know everything you can tell me about my adoption," I said, getting straight to the point. "I know this might be hard for you, but I need to know." My parents exchanged a glance before my father spoke. "We don't know much," he admitted. "The adoption was closed. We were told that your birth mother was very young, probably still in her teens. She wasn't in a position to raise a child. Do you know her name?" I asked, my heart pounding. My mother shook her head. "We were never given that information. We only know that she made the decision to give you up for adoption because she wanted you to have a better life than she could provide." I nodded, trying to process this information. It wasn't much, but it was a start. What about the adoption agency? Do you remember which one it was? My parents gave me the name of the agency, and I felt a small surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the search. I contacted the adoption agency, but they informed me that many of their records from that time had been lost in a fire. They could confirm that I had been adopted through their agency, but they couldn't provide any information about my birth parents. This setback was frustrating, but I refused to give up. I joined online forums for adoptees, seeking advice from others who had been in similar situations. I even considered DNA testing, though the idea of potentially uncovering unknown relatives was both exciting and terrifying. Throughout this process, my relationship with my adoptive parents continued to evolve. There were still moments of tension and hurt, but we were slowly rebuilding trust. They supported my search even though I could see the fear in their eyes, the worry that if I found my birth parents, I might love them less. "You're our daughter," my mother said one day, her voice trembling slightly. "No matter what you discover, that will never change." Her words touched me deeply, and I realized that despite everything, I did love them. They had made a terrible mistake in keeping my adoption a secret, but they had also given me a loving home and had been there for me throughout my life. At work, I was starting to regain my focus. My boss noticed the improvement and called me into his office. "You seem to be doing better," he observed. "Whatever was going on, I'm glad to see you're back on track." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you for your patience," I said. "It's been a challenging time, but I'm working through it." As the weeks turned into months, my search for my birth parents hit several dead ends. But strangely, the process of searching was helping me come to terms with my adoption. I was learning about the complexities of adoption, about the difficult choices birth parents often face, about the love that goes into both giving up a child and choosing to raise one that isn't biologically yours. One evening, as I was discussing my search with my husband, he asked me a question that made me pause. "What are you hoping to find?" he asked gently. "What do you think will change if you meet your birth parents?" I sat in silence for a moment, really considering his question. "I'm not sure," I admitted finally. "I guess I'm hoping for answers, for a sense of where I come from. But maybe I'm also looking for a sense of belonging that I feel I've lost." My husband took my hand. "You belong here," he said softly. "With me, with your parents who raised you, with your brother. Your family loves you, not because of biology, but because of who you are." His words struck a chord in me. I realized that while I still wanted to know about my biological origins, I didn't need that information to know who I was or where I belonged. The next day, I called my parents and invited them over for dinner. As we sat around the table, sharing a meal and conversation, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was my family, regardless of biology. They had made mistakes, yes, but so had I. We were all human, all flawed, all trying our best to love each other. As I looked around at the faces of my loved ones, I realized that family isn't defined by blood or by perfection. It's defined by love, by shared experiences, by the choice to stand by each other through good times and bad. I still had questions about my biological origins, and I knew I would continue to search for answers. But I also knew that whatever I discovered, it wouldn't change the fundamental truth of who I was or who my family was. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of acceptance that I hadn't experienced since discovering my adoption. I was adopted, yes. But I was also loved. I was also strong. I was also capable of forgiveness and growth. I drifted off to sleep, feeling grateful for the family I had and curious about the biological family I might one day discover. But most of all, I felt at peace with myself, with my identity as both an adopted child and a beloved daughter. The journey wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in months, I felt ready to face whatever came next, not alone, but with the support of the family that had chosen me, and that I was choosing in return. Update 1. It's been a month since my last post, and a lot has happened. The situation has calmed down somewhat, but new challenges have emerged. First, the good news. With the help of my friend's advice, I've slowly started to reconnect with my parents. We began with text messages and had a brief face-to-face conversation last week. I could see that they're really trying to understand my feelings, which has helped to soften my heart a little. However, a new issue has arisen. I've developed a strong desire to know more about my biological origins. When I asked my parents about it, they said they didn't know much. This has led to a new source of frustration. I have a right to know about my biological parents, I insisted during one of our conversations. My father seemed reluctant. Finding that information might not make you happier, he cautioned. His words angered me again. That's for me to decide, I retorted. Meanwhile, my relationship with my husband has become strained. While he's trying to understand my feelings, he's also started saying things like, maybe it's time to move on. Your parents love you. Isn't that enough? He asked one night. But it's not that simple for me. You don't understand, I snapped back, leading to an argument. The stress has started to affect my work as well. My concentration has suffered, and I made a mistake on an important project. My boss reprimanded me harshly, and I'm worried I might miss out on a promotion opportunity if this continues. Despite these challenges, I've decided to pursue information about my biological parents. I began by asking my adoptive parents for any details they might have about my adoption. At first, they were hesitant. We're not sure how much we should say, my mother admitted during one of our therapy sessions. We don't want to hurt you more than we already have. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. I appreciate that you're trying to protect me, I said, but I need to know. Please, tell me everything you can. Slowly, they began to share what they knew. They told me that I was adopted through a private agency when I was just a few days old. They didn't know much about my birth parents, only that my biological mother was very young when she had me and wasn't in a position to raise a child. This information, while limited, felt like a key unlocking a door I didn't even know existed. I threw myself into research, contacting adoption agencies and scouring online databases for any information I could find. My husband watched my growing obsession with concern. I'm worried about you, he said one night as I sat hunched over my laptop, eyes bleary from hours of searching. This is consuming you. I knew he was right, but I couldn't stop. The need to know, to understand where I came from, had become all-encompassing. At work, I managed to pull myself together enough to avoid any more major mistakes, but my boss was still watching me closely. I knew I was on thin ice, but I couldn't bring myself to care as much as I should have. Then, after weeks of searching, I had a breakthrough. I found a record that matched the few details I had about my adoption. With shaking hands, I filled out a request for more information. When the envelope arrived a week later, I stared at it for hours before I could bring myself to open it. Inside was a name and an address. My biological mother was alive, and she lived in the same city as me. The shock of this discovery sent me into an emotional tailspin. I oscillated between excitement, fear, and anger. Why had she given me up? Did she ever think about me? Did she have other children? I shared the news with my husband that night. His reaction surprised me. Are you going to contact her? He asked, his voice tight with concern. Of course, I replied. I need to know the truth. He shook his head. I'm not sure that's a good idea. What if she doesn't want to meet you? What if she has a family who doesn't know about you? His words stung, but I couldn't deny the validity of his concerns. Still, I felt a pull towards this woman who had given birth to me, a need to understand my origins that I couldn't ignore. The next day, I confided in my best friend about my discovery. She listened patiently as I poured out my fears and hopes. It's natural to want answers, she said gently. But remember, your adoptive parents are the ones who raised you, who loved you all these years. Her words made me pause. In my quest to find my biological mother, had I been neglecting the parents who had actually been there for me throughout my life? With this thought in mind, I decided to have a conversation with my adoptive parents before making any moves to contact my biological mother. When I told them about my discovery, their reactions were mixed. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We always knew this day might come," she said softly. "We want you to be happy, but we're scared of losing you." My father nodded in agreement. "You're our daughter, no matter what. We just hope you remember that." Their vulnerability touched me deeply. For the first time, I truly understood the fear that had driven them to keep my adoption a secret for so long. It didn't excuse their actions, but it helped me understand them better. "You're not going to lose me," I assured them, reaching out to hold their hands. "You're my parents. Nothing will change that." As I left their house that day, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. I still wanted to meet my biological mother, but I no longer felt the desperate urgency that had been driving me before. At work, my newfound calm translated into improved performance. My boss noticed the change and commended me on my recent project. "Whatever was going on with you, I'm glad to see you've sorted it out," he said. I smiled, realizing that I was finally starting to find balance in my life again. That night, I sat down with my husband to have an honest conversation about everything that had been happening. "I want to meet my biological mother," I told him. "But I want you to be a part of this process with me. Your support means everything to me." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," he said. "We'll do this together." As we hugged, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with my husband by my side and a newfound understanding with my adoptive parents, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The search for my biological mother had opened up a whole new chapter in my life, one filled with both challenges and opportunities for growth. As I prepared to take the next step in this journey, I realized that family isn't just about blood, it's about love, understanding, and the willingness to stand by each other through thick and thin. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update, and the situation has become even more complex. I'm facing new conflicts and challenges that I never anticipated. After much deliberation, I finally decided to reach out to my biological mother. I wrote a carefully worded letter, introducing myself and explaining that I had recently learned about my adoption. I included my contact information and said that I would be open to meeting if she was willing. The wait for a response was agonizing. Every day, I checked my mailbox and email obsessively. My husband tried to distract me, but my mind was constantly preoccupied with thoughts of my biological mother. Finally, after 2 weeks that felt like an eternity, I received a reply. My biological mother wrote that she was shocked but glad to hear from me. She explained that she had been very young when she had me and wasn't in a position to raise a child. She had always hoped I would have a good life with my adoptive family. Reading her words, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. There was relief that she had responded positively, anger at the circumstances that led to my adoption, and a deep, aching curiosity to know more about her and my biological father. I shared the letter with my husband and my adoptive parents. My husband was supportive but cautious. "Take it slow," he advised. "This is a big change for everyone involved." My adoptive parents' reactions were more complicated. I could see the fear in their eyes, the worry that they might lose me to this woman who shared my blood. "We're happy for you," my mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "But please remember that we're your parents too. We've loved you from the moment we first held you." Their words made me realize how difficult this situation was for them. I hugged them tightly, reassuring them of my love. "You'll always be my parents," I promised. "Nothing will change that." As I prepared to meet my biological mother for the first time, I found myself struggling with my identity more than ever. Who was I? The successful IT project manager raised by loving adoptive parents? Or the daughter of a woman I had never met, with a whole other life I knew nothing about? These questions weighed heavily on me as I walked into the cafe where I had arranged to meet my biological mother. I spotted her immediately, a woman in her early 50s with the same color eyes as mine. As our gazes met, I felt a jolt of recognition. Our first meeting was emotional and awkward. We both cried as we hugged for the first time. As we talked, I learned more about the circumstances of my birth and adoption. She had been only 19 when she had me, a college student unprepared for motherhood. My biological father had left when he found out about the pregnancy. "I wanted you to have a better life than I could give you," she explained, her eyes filled with tears. "But I've thought about you every day since I gave you up." As I listened to her story, I felt my anger and resentment slowly melting away. I could see the pain and regret in her eyes, and I realized that the decision to give me up must have been incredibly difficult for her. Over the next few weeks, my biological mother and I continued to meet and get to know each other. I learned that I have 2 half-siblings, a fact that both excited and terrified me. She hadn't told her family about me yet, unsure of how they would react. This new relationship brought joy but also complications. My adoptive parents, while trying to be supportive, were clearly struggling with feelings of jealousy and insecurity. My husband worried that I was getting too invested too quickly. At work, the emotional toll of these changes began to show. I found myself distracted, making small mistakes that I would never have made before. My boss called me into his office one day, concern evident on his face. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Your work has been slipping lately." I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Finally, I decided to be honest. I explained the situation with my adoption and my biological mother. To my surprise, my boss was incredibly understanding. "Take the time you need to sort this out," he said. "Your work has always been excellent. I trust you'll get back on track when you're ready." His support was a huge relief, but it also made me realize how much my search for identity had been affecting every aspect of my life. As I continued to navigate these complicated relationships, I found myself at a crossroads. I loved getting to know my biological mother and learning about my roots, but I also felt a deep loyalty to my adoptive parents who had raised and loved me for 34 years. One night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, my husband turned to me. "What do you want?" he asked simply. "Not what you think you should want, or what others want for you. What do you want?" His question hit me hard. What did I want? I wanted to know my biological family, but I didn't want to lose the family I'd always known. I wanted to understand my origins, but I didn't want to forget the life I'd built. As I pondered these thoughts, I realized that I didn't have to choose. I could be both the daughter of my adoptive parents and the biological child of my birth mother. I could honor both my nature and my nurture. With this realization came a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I decided to organize a meeting between all the important people in my life, my adoptive parents, my biological mother, and my husband. It was time for everyone to meet and for us to figure out how to move forward together. Update 3. It's been 3 months since my last update, and I'm finally starting to feel like I'm finding my footing in this new reality. The meeting I organized between my adoptive parents, my biological mother, and my husband was incredibly tense at first. Everyone was polite, but I could feel the undercurrent of anxiety and uncertainty in the room. My adoptive mother was the first to break the ice. She turned to my biological mother and said, "Thank you for giving us the greatest gift of our lives." The sincerity in her voice brought tears to everyone's eyes, including mine. From that moment, the atmosphere changed. We talked for hours, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of my history. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build relationships with both my adoptive and biological families. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I felt pulled in different directions, torn between loyalties. But slowly, we started to find a balance. At work, things improved significantly. With the weight of secrecy lifted and a new support system in place, I was able to focus better. My boss noticed the change and called me into his office. "I'm impressed with how you've turned things around," he said. "In fact, I'd like to offer you a promotion." I was stunned and grateful. It felt like validation that I could handle the complexities in my personal life without sacrificing my professional goals. My relationship with my husband also strengthened through this process. His unwavering support and willingness to navigate this new family dynamic with me brought us closer than ever. One evening, as we were discussing the future, he asked, "Have you thought about having children of our own?" The question took me by surprise. With everything that had happened, I hadn't given much thought to starting a family. But as I considered it, I realized that my experiences had given me a unique perspective on family and love. "I think I'd like that," I said. "And I think I understand now, more than ever, that love is what makes a family, not just biology." He smiled and squeezed my hand. I couldn't agree more. As for my relationship with my biological mother, it continues to evolve. We're not as close as I am with my adoptive parents after all. They're the ones who raised me, but we're building a meaningful connection. She's shared more about my biological father, who, unfortunately, isn't interested in meeting me, and about my half-siblings, who I hope to meet someday. My adoptive parents have been incredibly understanding throughout this process. They've assured me time and time again that they support my relationship with my biological mother, even though I know it's not always easy for them. Last week, we celebrated my birthday. For the first time, both my adoptive and biological families were present. As I looked around the room at all these people who loved me, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I won't pretend that everything is perfect now. There are still moments of confusion, times when I struggle with my identity. I still have questions about my past that may never be fully answered. And I know that as we move forward, new challenges will arise. But I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or by perfection. It's defined by love, by choice, by the willingness to stand by each other through good times and bad. I'm no longer the angry, confused person I was when I first discovered my adoption. I'm stronger now, more secure in who I am. I'm a daughter, a wife, a sister, a friend. I'm adopted, yes, but that's just one part of my story. As I look to the future, I feel a sense of excitement. I don't know what challenges lie ahead, but I know I have a strong support system to help me face them. I'm curious about what other discoveries I might make about my biological heritage, but I'm no longer desperate for that information to define me. Most importantly, I've learned the power of forgiveness both for others and for myself. I've forgiven my adoptive parents for keeping the truth from me, understanding that they acted out of love, however misguided. I've forgiven my biological mother for giving me up, recognizing the difficult choice she faced. And I've forgiven myself for the anger and hurt I felt, understanding that those emotions were a natural part of the process. As I end this update, I want to thank everyone who has followed my story and offered support. Your words of encouragement have meant more than you know. To anyone out there who might be going through a similar situation, I want to say, it gets better. It's not easy, and the journey is different for everyone, but there is hope. Family, I've learned, is what you make it. It's messy and complicated and beautiful. And I'm grateful for every part of mine.